In 1961, a family that had just arrived in Virginia from Venezuela bought a 550-acre farm in the Shenandoah Valley. The place was for sale, cheap for one reason. In the words of the county itself, it was the most worn-out, eroded, and abused piece of ground in the area. Soil organic matter, around 1%. Topsoil almost gone. Pastures washing off the hill every time it rained. The extension officer told the new owner what every neighbor was doing: plant corn, build silos, spread chemical fertilizer, graze the woodlots down. He did none of it. 6 decades later, roughly 100 acres of that same farm now produce, in a single year, 30,000 pounds of beef, 60,000 pounds of pork, 12,000 broiler chickens, 50,000 dozen eggs, 1,000 rabbits, and 600 turkeys. No chemical fertilizer has ever been used on the property. No commercial seed has ever been planted. Soil organic matter has climbed from around 1% to more than 8%. This is the story of the farm that most of Augusta County spent 40 years calling a lunatic operation. The son of that family is Joel Salatin. He is 68 years old. Time magazine calls him the world's most innovative farmer. The New York Times magazine, in 2005, called him the high priest of the pasture. The Washington Post, in 2013, called him America's most famous farmer. Michael Pollan built the middle chapters of The Omnivore's Dilemma around his operation. Food Incorporated, nominated for an Oscar in 2009, made him the on-camera face of what industrial agriculture is not. He describes himself, without irony, as a Christian libertarian environmentalist capitalist lunatic farmer. The lunatic part is not modest. His teachers told him he was throwing his life away when he chose farming out of an honors program. His neighbors reported him repeatedly to state inspectors. Regulators told him it was illegal to butcher his own chickens for a customer, illegal to sell raw milk from his own cows, illegal to charge a visitor for a tour of his own land. In 2007, he titled a book about the experience "Everything I Want to Do is Illegal." And meanwhile, on 100 acres of pasture in a single valley, his family now feeds more than 5,000 households, 50 restaurants, and 10 retail stores. Almost everyone told him it could not be done, and if it could, it was against the law. Subscribe and watch him be proven right anyway. To understand what Polyface actually did, you first have to understand what conventional Shenandoah farming had done. For about 2 centuries, farmers in the valley followed a single recipe: clear the woods, plow the slopes, plant corn where nature had planted forest, overgraze the pastures until the topsoil ran off, then buy nitrogen from a bag to replace what the ground could no longer make on its own. Buy antibiotics for the animals to survive the crowding. Buy new fertility in the form of chemical inputs every single spring. By the middle of the 20th century, the results were visible from any hilltop in the county. Soil that had once been 6 feet deep now measured 6 inches. Water no longer sank into the pastures. It ran off, and it took what was left of the soil with it. This is the industrial trap. Chemical agriculture is not a partnership with the land. It is a substitution. The bag of fertilizer replaces the earthworm, the manure pat, the legume, the microbe. Every year the substitution has to be larger, because every year the biology that used to do the work for free is a little more dead. Left alone, an industrial pasture does not slowly recover. It slowly requires more chemistry. By 1961, the farm William Salatin, bought in Swope, Virginia, was so far into that spiral that it sold for the price of the fence posts. Every extension officer in the county could tell him exactly what to do next. Bill Salatin did the opposite of every single one of those instructions. Joel's father Bill had flown in the Navy in the Second World War and worked as a bilingual accountant for the Texas Oil Company in the Venezuelan highlands, saving for 7 years to buy a 1,000-acre farm outside Caracas. When Perez Jimenez fell in 1958 and land redistribution began, the family lost the farm. In Joel's telling, they were walked off it at gunpoint. They arrived in Virginia with what they could carry, bought the cheapest land they could find, and started over. Bill Salatin had one thing most of his new neighbors did not. His own father, Joel's grandfather, had been a founding subscriber to J. Wash Rodale's Organic Gardening and Farming magazine in 1948. 3 generations of the Salatin family had spent a decade quietly reading, in a small Sarajevo magazine most Virginia farmers ignored, that soil was alive, and that living soil could be fed instead of drugged. So when the extension officer told Bill to plant corn, Bill planted trees. Where he was told to buy fertilizer, he built water diversions to keep what soil was left on the hill. Where he was told the land was finished, he answered, in a line his son has quoted for 60 years, "We can heal it." Joel grew up watching that quiet argument with the entire county. He was, according to every teacher who ever wrote a report on him, throwing his life away by wanting to farm. He graduated from Bob Jones University in 1979, worked as a reporter at the Staunton News Leader, and in 1982 moved back to the farm full-time to prove them all wrong. So how do you rebuild 8% organic matter in ground that was down to 1? You do not plant it, you do not fertilize it, you do not really work it in any way an agronomy textbook would recognize. You move animals. The move that eventually made Polyface famous is a piece of engineering Salatin calls the salad bar. Instead of putting a cow on a pasture and leaving her there for the season, Salatin moves his whole herd every single day, using portable electric fence, to a new patch of grass. Sometimes 400 cows on 3 acres for a day. Sometimes 300 cows on a quarter acre for a few hours. Then they leave, and the pasture is not touched again for weeks while it grows back. The result is not what the textbook predicts. On a Polyface acre, Salatin averages around 400 cow days per year. In Augusta County as a whole, the average is around 80. Roughly 5 times more cattle from the same acre, without seeding it, without spraying it, and without buying a single bag of nitrogen. But the cattle are only the first act. Exactly 4 days after the cows leave a paddock, an oddly shaped trailer rolls in behind them. It is a mobile henhouse Salatin calls the Eggmobile. 4 days is not a random number. Fly larvae in a fresh cow patty take about 4 days to reach the pupal stage, which is when they are large enough for a laying hen to hunt them. The chickens hop out of the Eggmobile, kick the patties apart, eat the pupating maggots, spread the manure, and lay eggs while they work. About 15% of their feed comes free from the ground the cows just fertilize. Then come the broiler chickens, in low portable pens Salatin calls chicken tractors, dragged to fresh grass every morning. Then the turkeys. Then, in the winter shed where the cattle spent the cold months, the pigs. The pig job is the one people remember. All winter, cattle bedding piles up in a deep pack under the herd, mixed with corn kernels Salatin has deliberately buried in the pile as it grows. When the cattle go back out to pasture in spring, the pigs come in and spend a few weeks looking for those buried, fermented kernels, which by then are essentially small alcoholic prizes. They root through the entire pack, aerating 6 months of manure into finished compost in a few weeks of enthusiastic digging. Salatin calls it piga rata pork. He also calls it respecting the pigness of the pig, a phrase he means literally, and has written an entire book about. The chain of logic is what makes the whole system hold together. Cows fed by grass, Grass fed by manure. Manure processed by chickens. Chickens fed partly by that manure. Compost turned by pigs. Pigs fed partly by pasture and partly by the compost job itself. And the soil, underneath all of it, fed by everything. Salatin's summary of the method fits on a bumper sticker. Fence is the cheapest fertilizer you can buy. What the fence does is decide who is on which patch of ground on which day. The animals do the fertilizing themselves. There is one detail that sits at the center of all of this. In 65 years, Polyface has never planted a seed. The grass that feeds the cattle, that feeds the chickens, that feeds the pigs, that feeds the soil, is simply the grass that was already there in 1961, released from the mowing machine of continuous overgrazing and finally allowed to grow up. The Salatins have kept receipts. Soil organic matter has climbed from around 1% in 1961 to more than 8% today. The farm has never bought a bag of chemical fertilizer, never used antibiotics, hormones, dewormers, or vaccines on its animals, and never applied for organic certification, because Joel considers the USDA organic label a floor rather than a ceiling, and calls his own operation Beyond Organic. On roughly 100 acres of open pasture, Polyface now produces, per year, according to figures Michael Pollan documented, 30,000 pounds of beef, 60,000 pounds of pork, 12,000 broilers, 50,000 dozen eggs, 1,000 rabbits, and 600 turkeys. The farm sells directly to more than 5,000 households, 50 restaurants, and 10 retail outlets. In 2009, Salatin received the 15th Heinz Award for the environment, with a $100,000 prize attached. By 2015, the operation was documented as generating around $1.8 million in annual sales. But the receipts have to include the caveats too. Polyface, for all the poetry of its pasture, is not a self-contained system. The chickens and pigs eat grain, and that grain is bought in from other farms. When Adam Merberg ran the calorie math of Pollan's own numbers, he found that Polyface consumes roughly 244 million calories a year in imported grain to produce about 171 million calories of food. Salatin has, in effect, confirmed the arithmetic. The point of Polyface is not that it produces more calories than a factory farm. It does not. The point is that it produces more dollars, more diversity, and more soil per acre, on ground industrial agriculture had written off without poisoning anything downstream. The broiler chickens that made Polyface famous are also, by Salatin's own admission in his book, The Sheer Ecstasy of Being a Lunatic Farmer, the least sustainable part of the operation. He uses Cornish cross birds, the same industrial hybrid used in factory sheds. He knows it, he says it. He has not found a heritage breed that performs anywhere near as well on pasture, and he is honest about the compromise. And an honest accounting has to include the man himself. In 2020, Joel Salatin wrote and said things about the COVID pandemic and about race in the food system that lost him his long-running column at Mother Earth News, cost him allies inside the sustainable agriculture movement, and hardened lines that had been softer for decades. The soil work is real. The animal work is real. The politics are contested, and pretending otherwise would break the same standard of honesty the farm insists on for everything else. The farmhouse at Polyface was built in 1750. It has sat on the same ridge for more than 270 years. From that ridge on any given afternoon, you can see something no extension officer in 1961 could have predicted. Look one way, into the Polyface fields, and the pasture is standing waist-high, dark green, running with birds and butterflies, and a low continuous sound of chickens working manure into ground. The soil under your boots is springy, It gives, the way a forest floor gives. Look the other way, across the fence line, at a neighbor still following the instructions the county gave William Salatin in 1961, and the pasture is short, pale, and quiet. The ground is hard. The topsoil is thin. The bag of fertilizer sits by the barn door where it has sat, in one form or another, for 6 decades. The farm the state had written off in 1961 hosts hundreds of buses of visitors every year. Joel's son Daniel runs the day-to-day. His grandchildren are already learning the fence work. "We can heal it," Bill Salatin said in 1961. One of them was wrong about that piece of ground. It was not the Lunatic. If the mechanics of rebuilding worn-out land without a single chemical input interest you, subscribe. There are ranchers restoring grasslands by putting more cattle on them, not fewer. There are farmers healing dried-up creeks by refusing to remove the plants a government had banned. And there are alpine hillsides turning back into orchards because one Austrian farmer refused to prune his trees. The logic behind each one is just as counterintuitive as this one.